He was just a student. I was supposed to be the responsible one. But the night he showed up at my door, everything changed. I knew I was crossing a line, but I also knew I couldn't go back. There was something about that evening, the way the air settled in the studio, thick with silence and the faint scent of paint and graphite, that made everything feel unusually still. Miles Whitaker sat alone at his desk, correcting sketches left behind by his evening students. The only sounds the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the old wood floor. He was used to the quiet. It had become his shelter over the years. At 34, Miles had found comfort in routine, in the predictable rhythm of teaching, grading, going home, and doing it all over again. He wasn't unhappy, not exactly. But there was a kind of numbness to his days, a sense of distance from the world that made things feel safe and dull. That was when Calder Ruiz walked in. He was late. The door creaked open gently, and a figure slipped inside, hesitating by the entrance. Miles looked up from the stack of papers in front of him, expecting to see a lost janitor or someone from the next class. But it was a student, young, maybe 22 or 23, with an apologetic smile and a camera bag slung over his shoulder. His expression held the awkward confidence of someone who was used to entering rooms late, but never quite felt unwelcome. "Sorry," he said softly, more with his eyes than with his voice, and made his way toward the corner of the room. Miles nodded silently, watching him settle in. There was something about the way he moved, unguarded, curious. Most new students try to blend in, but Calder seemed to be taking everything in as if it mattered. They didn't speak much that first class. Calder listened carefully, took notes, asked a question or two. But it was his attention that lingered. He watched the way Miles explained things, not with the disinterested gaze of someone trying to pass a course, but with the quiet focus of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. When the class ended and the rest of the students began to filter out, Calder lingered, slowly packing up his things. Miles noticed, but said nothing. He just continued collecting pencils, placing them into the metal jar by the window. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but present. "I like how you talk about light," Calder said finally, his voice calm, almost like a thought that escaped his lips by accident. Miles looked up, mildly surprised. "Most people talk about technique or balance, but you talk like light has a personality." Miles offered a faint smile, unsure how to respond. Compliments always felt too personal, too close. But something in Calder's voice was genuine. Not flattery, just observation. From that night on, Calder always arrived a little early and stayed a little late. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words stayed with Miles long after the studio had emptied. There was something unspoken forming between them, not through gestures or glances, but through stillness, through how they occupied the same space. How silence between them didn't feel heavy. It felt full. Miles began noticing small things. How Calder's sketchbooks always had the corners worn down from being carried around too much. How he sometimes hummed softly to himself when he was thinking. How he tilted his head slightly when listening, as if trying to understand not just what was said, but what was left unsaid. And then there was the way Calder looked at him. Not in the way students usually looked at their teachers, with respect or curiosity or disinterest, but in a way that felt searching, like he was trying to read a story written in invisible ink. Miles tried not to read into it. Try not to notice how those glances made something shift inside him. He reminded himself of the age difference, the boundaries. He was a teacher. Calder was a student. That should have been enough to quiet the strange warmth that had started to grow in the quiet corners of his day. But it wasn't. One night, after class, it rained. Hard. The kind of rain that made people wait indoors instead of rushing home. Calder stood by the window, watching droplets race each other down the glass. Miles sat behind his desk, pretending to finish some notes. The sound of the rain wrapped around them like a soft wall, cutting the world away. Neither of them said anything. They didn't have to. That night, when Miles went home, he didn't turn on the lights. He sat on his couch in the dark, the memory of the rain still echoing in his ears, and thought about the quiet, about how different it felt now, how it wasn't just silence anymore, but something waiting to become more. He couldn't explain it, couldn't name it, but something had shifted, And somewhere deep down, Miles knew the stillness would never be the same again. The days that followed moved slowly, wrapped in a new kind of stillness, one that felt neither empty nor quiet, but expectant. Something had settled between them, not fully formed, not yet named, but present. It lived in the pauses, in the glances that lasted just a moment too long, in the air between two people trying not to notice how close they were becoming. Miles told himself it was nothing, that he was overthinking, projecting meaning into simple things. But it didn't stop the way his eyes lingered on Calder during class, or how his thoughts would drift back to him in the quiet moments at home. There was no specific reason, no defining moment he could point to, just 1,000 little ones that slowly changed the way he felt. Calder never pushed, never asked questions he shouldn't. But he stayed, always early, always the last to leave. Some evenings he'd help Miles put chairs back in place or collect scattered supplies, saying little, but always seeming like he had something else on the tip of his tongue. There were nights when the studio lights would dim with the setting sun, casting everything in a golden haze. On those evenings, Miles would catch Calder watching him, not with intensity, but with quiet recognition, as if seeing something in him that Miles had long stopped showing to the world. One evening, the class ended early. A soft autumn breeze crept in through the open windows, bringing with it the scent of rain and fallen leaves. The students filed out with sleepy goodbyes, leaving Miles and Calder alone once more. They didn't speak. Calder sat at one of the desks, slowly flipping through his sketchbook. Miles pretended to tidy the front table, but his attention kept drifting. The silence stretched, not awkward but fragile. Calder turned a page, revealing a charcoal study of light falling across a window pane. Miles glanced over, admiring the depth and softness of the work. But what caught his eye was the tiny figure in the corner of the frame. A man sitting at a desk, head bowed in thought. It was unmistakably him. He didn't comment, didn't ask. He just met Calder's eyes briefly, and Calder looked down, the corner of his mouth lifting in something like apology or understanding. Later that night, Miles sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his hands. He hadn't realized how long it had been since someone looked at him and saw more than a teacher, more than a name on a faculty page. There was something unnerving about it, something vulnerable. Yet it didn't feel wrong. It felt overdue. The next week brought more of the same. Silent gestures, soft tension, unspoken words hanging between them like leaves suspended mid-air, waiting to fall. One afternoon, a brief power outage plunged the studio into semi-darkness during a sudden thunderstorm. The students packed up quickly, uncertain, nervous about the weather. Calder stayed behind. He always did. They stood by the windows, watching the rain dance against the glass. No words passed between them, but something changed in the atmosphere. Miles felt it in the way his breath caught when Calder stepped a little closer, not touching, not speaking, just near enough to shift the air around him. It would have been easy to break the moment, to move, to speak, to laugh it off. But neither of them did. They stood there, shoulder to shoulder, watching the storm outside and feeling the quiet one unfolding between them. That night, Miles dreamt of light, of a room bathed in golden sun, and Calder sitting at the edge of it, looking at him not with questions, but with understanding. The dreams continued over the following days. Nothing dramatic, just fragments of soft conversation, of shared silence, of the warmth of another presence. Miles woke from them feeling both comforted and unsettled. He began to realize that he wasn't afraid of Calder. He was afraid of what Calder made him remember, the part of himself that still wanted, still longed, still felt. It had been a long time since he allowed himself that kind of vulnerability. One evening, Calder lingered again after class, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his sketchbook tucked under his arm. The room was quiet, the last of the sunlight stretching shadows across the floor. He hesitated near the door, turning slightly as if to speak. But then he simply gave a nod, almost imperceptible, and left. Miles stood alone in the room, feeling the weight of that pause, the space where words had almost been spoken. And he realized that sometimes the loudest confessions are the ones that never leave your lips. He didn't know where this was going, or if it was even allowed to go anywhere. But the silence had changed. It was no longer a shield. It had become an invitation. Autumn settled in slowly, like a blanket someone had gently pulled over the world. Leaves drifted past the windows in quiet spirals, and the days grew shorter, dimmer, colder. Inside the studio, the light changed, too, softer, lower, more golden as it fell across easels and sketch pads. The atmosphere turned hushed, contemplative, like the season itself had pressed pause on everything noisy and unnecessary. Miles noticed it in the way his own voice seemed quieter, more deliberate. In the way he moved through the studio, more aware of his surroundings and of Calder. The young man still came early, still stayed late. But now, the pauses between them had changed. They were no longer filled with the safety of unspoken possibility. Now, they buzzed with something more dangerous, awareness. Not just of each other's presence, but of what that presence meant. Calder didn't have to speak for Miles to know what he was feeling. It was in his posture, in the way his eyes would find Miles across the room and linger. There was a softness to his gaze, something Miles recognized only because he had once looked at someone the same way. Years ago, in a life that felt like someone else's. He tried to ignore it, tried to bury it beneath routine. But the more he tried, the more obvious it became. He caught himself watching Calder during critiques, listening more closely to his comments, wondering how someone so young could carry such quiet depth. And then came the moment Miles had feared without knowing it. It was a Friday. Rain tapped gently against the windows, and most students left quickly, eager to escape the damp evening. Calder remained, as always, under the pretense of organizing his portfolio. Miles stayed at his desk, distracted by unfinished paperwork and a storm brewing in his thoughts. The quiet stretched between them, but it was heavier than usual. Then Calder spoke, softly, his voice low, like he didn't want to scare the words away. It wasn't a question. Not exactly. Just a thought spoken out loud. A reflection. Sometimes I wonder if people stop letting themselves want things just because they're afraid they won't be allowed to have them. Miles didn't look up. His hand tightened slightly around the pencil he was holding. He said nothing. The silence that followed felt different. Not awkward. Not peaceful. But suspended. On the edge of something unspoken and dangerously close to becoming real. When Miles finally glanced up, Calder wasn't looking at him anymore. He was gazing out the window, his fingers resting lightly on the table's edge, like he was holding on to something invisible. That night, Miles couldn't sleep. He sat by the window in his apartment, staring out at the streetlights, his thoughts scattered and restless. For years, he had chosen silence, not because it was easier, but because it felt safer. Wanting led to vulnerability. Vulnerability led to pain. And he had grown tired of carrying invisible wounds. But Calder had found the crack in that silence. Not by force, but by simply being present. By seeing him, not as a teacher, not as an adult with responsibilities, but as someone still capable of feeling. And that realization terrified him. Over the next few days, Miles became distant. He spoke less in class, avoided lingering in the studio. Calder noticed. Of course he did. But he didn't press. He simply gave space, stepping back just enough to let Miles retreat into himself. But distance, Miles learned, did not quiet the storm. It only gave it room to grow. He began to see Calder everywhere. Not literally, but in everything. In the curve of a line drawn across a canvas. In the way light filtered through the windows. In the silence between heartbeats that felt too loud. One evening, Miles found himself walking past the park near campus, lost in thought. The trees stood bare, skeletal outlines against a fading sky. He paused by the edge of the path, watching the wind tug at the last remaining leaves. He remembered a conversation from years ago. Someone had once told him that silence wasn't always absence. Sometimes it was possibility, a space waiting to be filled. For the first time, he wondered if the silence between him and Calder wasn't a warning, but an invitation. The next day, he almost didn't come to class. But he did, and Calder was there, as always. They didn't speak. Not really. But when their eyes met across the room, something passed between them, a quiet acknowledgement of the space they now stood in. It was no longer undefined. It was a threshold, one they hadn't yet crossed, but were no longer pretending didn't exist. The night unfolded quietly, like a breath held too long finally being released. Miles hadn't planned to go anywhere. His evening routine was already in motion. Tea cooling untouched on the counter, his phone resting face down on the couch. But the silence felt different. Not calming, not familiar. It was restless, charged with something he could no longer ignore. It had been days since he'd allowed himself to look directly at the feeling that had been growing. He'd spent every moment trying to stay busy, trying to build walls around thoughts that were louder in his mind with every passing day. But that night, the walls cracked. There was no one else to distract him, no lessons to plan, no sketches to critique, just the quiet, and Calder's presence lingering in the back of his thoughts. His phone buzzed once. A simple message, "Can't sleep." You. He stared at it for a long time, heart pulsing in rhythm with the light of the screen. And then, without letting himself think too much, he responded. "No. Want to talk." Calder's answer came quickly. "I'm outside." When Miles opened the door, the world seemed smaller somehow. The air was cool, still carrying the scent of autumn and the promise of rain. Calder stood on the porch, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes uncertain but calm. There was no dramatic greeting, no need for words. Miles simply stepped aside, and Calder walked in, the sound of the door closing behind them loud in the otherwise silent room. They ended up on the couch, just like always, but nothing about the moment felt the same. The space between them was filled with the weight of everything they hadn't said. Yet there was no pressure, no rush. The world had already narrowed to this single moment, and neither of them seemed in a hurry to push it forward. Miles sat with his hands in his lap, gaze lowered. Calder leaned back, silent, his posture open but still. The television remained off. No music played. It was just them, and the low hum of the heater clicking on and off, the occasional groan of the pipes, and the rhythm of two hearts learning how to listen. Eventually, Calder reached out, fingers brushing against Miles's hand. The touch was feather-light, a question asked in silence. Miles didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his palm over, letting their hands rest together, fingers barely intertwined. There was something grounding in that touch. Not because it was bold or passionate, but because it was real, intentional, present. Time passed like water moving slowly through narrow places, unrushed, inevitable. No one said the words out loud, but the room understood them. It wasn't love, not yet. Not in the way people define it in books or films. It was something quieter. The first moment someone lets you see them not as they've learned to be, but as they truly are. Vulnerable. Uncertain, open. Miles felt it in the way Calder leaned just slightly closer, not asking for anything more than to be near. He felt it in the warmth of their joined hands, in the air that no longer felt heavy with silence, but full of meaning. He wasn't afraid anymore. Not in the same way. The fear was still there, yes, what would happen next, what this meant, where it might lead, but it was softened now by something steadier, trust. Without thinking, Miles rested his head gently against Calder's shoulder. The movement was tentative, like stepping into a space he wasn't sure he was allowed to enter. But Calder didn't move. He simply exhaled, slow, steady, and turned slightly to make the space more comfortable. It stayed like that for a long time. There was no kiss, no declaration, no dramatic shift, just two people sitting in the quiet, hands touching, the lines between friendship and something more blurring gently without force. At some point, the rain started. It tapped softly against the windows, casting moving shadows across the floor. The warmth between them grew more tangible, more certain. And Miles realized that sometimes the most powerful moments in life aren't the ones filled with fireworks or fanfare, but the ones where two people finally stop pretending. It wasn't about what happened that night. It was about what it meant. The walls that had separated them, age, fear, uncertainty, rules, hadn't collapsed in one dramatic instant. They had simply been stepped around, one quiet choice at a time. And as the hours slipped past and the night deepened, Miles felt something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. Peace. Not because everything was resolved, but because for the first time in years, he wasn't alone in his silence. The days that followed carried a different weight. Nothing extravagant had happened. No grand declarations. No sudden change in routines. Yet everything felt shifted, as if the axis of Miles's world had tilted just slightly, enough to make the ordinary feel new again. Mornings came with more light. The studio didn't feel so hollow after class. The silence that once echoed with loneliness now felt like a shared space, an echo of something real that no longer had to be named out loud to be felt. Calder continued to come early and stay late. But now, there was something unspoken between them that didn't strain. It simply was a presence, a choice. They didn't talk about that night, not directly, but neither of them pulled away. Their hands brushed more often, and their eyes met longer. Small gestures, unforced and steady, like stones placed carefully in the foundation of something they were both beginning to build. Miles found himself breathing more deeply. He noticed details he used to overlook, the way Calder hummed softly when focused, the way sunlight caught in his hair during afternoon sessions, how he smiled to himself when something he drew finally matched what he saw in his mind. But not everything was simple. There were moments when fear returned, sharp and quiet. Miles would find himself staring out the window after a long day, wondering if this was right, if this fragile connection could survive outside the space they'd built for it. The world beyond the studio wasn't always kind to quiet truths, and Miles had lived long enough to know that not everyone welcomed what they didn't understand. He saw it in the questions people didn't ask, in the subtle glances when Calder walked too close, in the careful way they kept their distance when others were around. And yet, despite it all, the quiet between them remained unshaken. One evening, as the final weeks of the semester approached, they found themselves back at the park near campus. The trees were nearly bare now, and the wind carried the cold promise of winter. Calder sat on the low wooden fence by the water's edge, sketchpad in hand, eyes fixed on the still surface of the lake. Miles stood beside him, watching the ripples form and fade with each gust of wind. It wasn't a moment of decision. It wasn't a confession. It was simply being together without armor. Eventually, Calder closed his sketchpad and turned to him. His expression was unreadable, thoughtful, but not uncertain. "I don't want to hide," he said, not loudly, not defiantly, just honestly. Miles nodded, the words settling into him like stones into a riverbed. He felt the truth of them ripple outward. He didn't want to hide either. Not from a feeling that had grown between them. Not from himself. And so they didn't. They didn't announce anything. They didn't make statements. But they stopped pretending. In small, simple ways, walking side by side a little closer, sharing quiet lunches on campus benches, meeting each other's eyes when no one else was watching. Their connection was never loud. It was steady. A thread woven carefully into their lives, unbreakable not because it was strong, but because it was chosen every day. Over time, those around them stopped wondering. Or maybe they never really knew what to ask. And in that ambiguity, Miles and Calder found freedom. They continued their routines. Calder graduated but still came by often. Miles kept teaching, but with a lighter heart. Their lives didn't become something extraordinary, but they became theirs. And that was enough. Sometimes at night, Miles would find himself awake, lying in bed as the sounds of the city drifted through the open window. Calder would be asleep beside him, one arm resting across his chest, his breathing steady and slow. In those moments, the world felt suspended, like time had offered them a pause to simply exist. Miles never took it for granted. Not the quiet, not the closeness, not the chance to begin again. He had spent so many years living around the edges of feeling, convinced that some things were no longer meant for him. But Calder had shown him something different, not through words, but through presence, through the way he stayed, through the way he looked at Miles, as if he wasn't something broken or lost, but simply someone who hadn't yet been seen fully. Now he was, not because they had solved everything, not because fear had vanished, but because they had chosen again and again to stay in the silence together and turn it into something that held them both. And in the end, that was the love Miles hadn't known he needed. Not loud, not perfect, just real.